1 week before Christmas, 1777, the 10,000 weary men of George Washington's army marched into the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania to a place called Valley Forge. 1 in 3 was unfit for duty.
Men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes. Their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet marching through frost and snow. George Washington.
Cloth tents could not protect the men from the brutal winter, so they began to clear the forest to build huts. From Valley Forge, Washington could keep an eye on the British 21 miles away in Philadelphia. And a winter encampment in a remote place without distractions was exactly what the commander-in-chief needed. Washington meant to forge a real army this winter, disciplined and uniformed, men who would not retreat at the sight of a bayonet. He wanted an army like the English had.
One of the ironies of Washington was that he was rather pro-British. And he wasn't pro-British politically, obviously. He tried to model the Continental Army along the lines of a traditional European army. So he was a conventional 18th century thinker.
Harsh discipline was routine. At Valley Forge, a court-martial sat nearly every day. An officer caught stealing had his sword broken over his head in front of his company. Deserters received 100 lashes for the first offense, and the punishment would be drawn out for days. The men repeatedly ignored the rules of sanitation. Washington finally had to issue an order that any man caught relieving himself anywhere but at the latrines would be court-martialed.
Washington knew that he had to be tough. He had to call on the men who were willing to do the things they need to do to keep a 18th century army in line. And that even means executing men when you have to in order to make sure that they understand that the rules are the rules.
One of the factors about whippings, the floggings that were used as punishments in armies and navies of the 18th century is that you are inflicting a very, very painful surface wound that will leave a permanent scar so that people will know you had misbehaved, but that don't permanently disable the individual, because then he's no good as a sailor or a soldier.
Washington had only 3 months to mold an army before spring arrived and the fighting resumed. On February 23, 1778, a foreign volunteer appeared in Washington's camp. The 47-year-old Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben introduced himself as a general and former aide-de-camp to King Frederick of Prussia, the greatest military mind of the age. Von Steuben claimed to be an expert at teaching military drill, but he asked for no pay and no rank until he proved himself. Impressed with von Steuben's credentials, Washington gave him the title of Acting Inspector General and the monumental task of training the American Army. The units of each state marched differently. They had no standard procedure for handling weapons. Their muskets were rusted. Barely half had bayonets, and most of those were used as spits to cook meat when they had meat to cook. Von Steuben, more impressed with the rebels' spirit than with their discipline, wrote to a friend in Europe,
"You say to your soldier, do this, and he does it. But I am obliged to say, This is the reason why you ought to do that. And then he does it.
Although von Steuben could curse in 3 languages, he couldn't speak English. Every night he wrote out the next day's orders in German. Then his aide translated them into French, and a French-speaking American translated them into English.
The right wheel, high. Right.
By the end of winter, von Steuben delivered what he promised, a closely drilled army. Yet he turned out to be an imposter. He was neither a baron nor a general. In fact, he had left the military 14 years earlier after rising no higher than captain. George Washington didn't care. Von Steuben had performed a miracle. He was promoted to Major General. Well into spring, the men were still hungry, half naked, and plagued by diseases, dysentery, smallpox, fevers, tormenting rashes. By early May 1778, 2,000 men had died in camp. 2,000 more had deserted.
The amazing thing to me is that these people deserted in such small numbers. People generally point out 1 in 10 deserted at Valley Forge. One is tempted to ask the question, what kept the other 9 around?
I think the soldiers of the Revolution suffered the privations and the hardships because of peer pressure. I think that was the major factor. Bottom line is your buddy in the mess, the guy that you cook this measly portion with and stand out in the rain with. That's going to be the real key to putting up with something as long as they did.
On May 5th, incredible news arrived at Valley Forge to cheer the soldiers. France had joined them in the war.
Benjamin Franklin in Paris had signed agreement with the French government to enter into alliance with the Americans for so long as the struggle took against the British. And this meant so much this was in a sense a decisive event in the war, this diplomatic revolution, this diplomatic victory, which immensely heartened and put a moral inspiration not only into the soldiers but into the population.
At Valley Forge, the soldiers marched and wheeled amid loud cheers for the King of France. In October of 1777, the British commander in America, General William Howe, asked to be relieved of what he called this very painful service. In May, Howe's replacement finally arrived.
General Henry Clinton was a very unfortunate character. He had wanted high command, but he got it at the stage when the British were actually recognizing that America was just one theater amongst many in this war that had broadened into a global struggle. He was rather lacking in confidence in himself. He was a complex character. Many people have said that he was ideally suited to be a second in command.
As a French fleet approached America, Clinton was ordered to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate his army in New York. On June 16th, 3,000 Loyalists, along with 2 regiments of Hessian mercenaries who might desert on a march, left the city by ship. The rest of the army, 10,000 men, set out overland with a year's worth of plunder. As the British retreated, Washington saw a rare chance to fight them on his terms. On the night of June 27th, he caught up with the British near Monmouth, New Jersey. After a council of war, he decided to attack. Following protocol, Washington gave the honor of leading the charge to his second-in-command, General Charles Lee, ironically the most outspoken opponent of this attack.
Major General Charles Lee is one of the more colorful characters on any side in the Revolutionary War. He had apparently a very squeaky type of voice, so he got on people's nerves that way. He also firmly believed that when God had created Charles Lee, he had achieved the pinnacle of success and nobody else was ever going to come close.
Lee wanted to be commander-in-chief himself. He considered Washington, in his words, not fit to command a sergeant's guard. On the hot, muggy morning of June 28th, Lee, with half the army, struck. Twice the British counterattacked. Twice they were beaten back. Then Lee began issuing a series of confused orders.
One order succeeded another with a rapidity and indecision calculated to ruin us. A regiment was ordered to form behind the fence and is speedily commanded to retire. All this disgraceful retreating. Colonel John Lawrence.
You have in Charles Lee an officer who missed Valley Forge, who missed the entire 1777 campaign. He made decisions at Monmouth based on the way he last remembered the American army fighting, not on what that American army was capable of doing.
Washington had always struggled to control his temper. When he spotted General Lee riding away from the battle, he lost it.
It was on a day that would have made any man swear. Yes, sir, he swore on that day, till the leaves shook on the trees. Never have I enjoyed such swearing before or since. General Charles Scott.
Only 200 yards from the British, Washington personally halted the retreat and rallied the men.
He rode all along the lines amid the shouts of the soldiers, cheering them by his voice and example, and restoring the fortunes of the fight. Never had I beheld so superb a man. The Marquis de Lafayette.
The British pressed their attack. This time, the Continentals stood their ground.
Monmouth is one of the bigger battles that's fought in the Revolution in terms of numbers of men on both sides engaged. And it's a battle that's fought almost exclusively with regulars. So it's really regular against regular. It's the test. How well did Steuben train? Because it's pretty much an even-up contest. You see, time after time after time, when they sit there and duke it out, the American unit cracks the British unit.
The cruelest foe on the field was the blistering heat, well over 100 degrees. Women known as Molly Pitchers carried water to cool both the men and the cannons. When one, Mary Ludwig Hayes, saw her husband go down, she rushed in herself, 7 months pregnant, and took his place.
A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs, carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for it might have carried away something else. Joseph Plum Martin.
George Washington was burning to launch a counteroffensive, but the setting sun thwarted his hopes. Clinton now did to Washington what Washington had twice done to the British. He slipped away during the night. The longest battle of the war ended in a draw, but Washington's army, drilled in the snows of Valley Forge, proved itself in the heat of Monmouth. Now, French soldiers were coming to risk their lives on American shores. But their admiral, the Comte d'Estaing, had taken 12.5 weeks to cross the Atlantic, nearly a month longer than the average journey. If d'Estaing had arrived just a few days earlier, he would have caught the British fleet outside New York Harbor and might have ended the revolution that summer. When Washington learned the heavy French vessels could not enter New York's shallow harbor, he gave up hope of capturing the city. D'Estaing offered him a consolation prize. He would attack the British garrison at Newport, Rhode Island. For the first Franco-American campaign, the rebels raised 6,000 enthusiastic militiamen, among them John Hancock, making his debut as an Army colonel, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere, now heading an artillery unit in the Massachusetts militia. The elegant French were less than impressed.
I have never seen a more laughable spectacle. All the tailors and apothecaries in the country must have been called out. They were mounted on bad nags and looked like a flock of ducks in crossbelts. Chevalier de Ponthieu.
American General John Sullivan and the Comte d'Estaing agreed to synchronize their attack on Newport. The French would land 4,000 troops on the west of the island, then begin a naval bombardment. The Americans would land on the eastern side and join the French north of the city. But Sullivan jumped the gun. He saw a sudden opening in the British defenses and decided to move his men a day early without consulting d'Estaing. The French admiral was infuriated. He called the breach of plan an insult to France. As d'Estaing and Sullivan argued, 20 British warships arrived from New York. The French and British fleets spent the next 24 hours maneuvering for the favor of the wind. Before even one shot was fired, a gale struck and blew for 3 days. The fierce winds and roiling waves knocked down masts and broke off rudders. After the weather cleared, d'Estaing announced he was leaving for Boston to repair his crippled fleet. He refused to leave Sullivan any of his able ships or men. Without French naval support, the Americans began to evacuate Rhode Island. The British pursued. Some of the most furious fighting of the day took place between Hessians and the 1st Rhode Island, a newly formed regiment of 125 black soldiers. For nearly 4 hours, the 1st Rhode Island fought with what was described as a desperate valor, repelling 3 Hessian assaults. They killed or wounded nearly 5 times more men than they lost in one of the fiercest actions of the war. Throughout the Revolution, as many as 5,000 black soldiers fought with the rebels. Just as many fled to the British.
Britain saw them as Tories who could be inspired to fight for Britain and for the empire on one very simple condition, that they were offered their freedom and given that freedom in exchange for taking arms. The South was exactly the opposite. The slaveholders had very, very serious reservations about arming black people for fear they would turn their arms against their owners. The Northerners felt that they must arm black people because they had too much to do keeping the farm going to enlist, say, for long terms in the Continental troops.
By 1778, 1 in 20 of Washington's soldiers was black. This was the last integrated American army until the Korean War. The battle for Rhode Island ended in a military setback and a diplomatic blunder. Chafing old wounds dating back to the French and Indian Wars, General John Sullivan publicly blamed the French.
The French fleet's sudden departure for Boston has raised every voice against the French nation and revived all those ancient prejudices against the sincerity of that people. I do resent the conduct of the Count.
The French fleet sailed for the West Indies, taking with it the bright promise of the alliance, and for 1778, Washington's last hope for a victory.